Shalom, and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of a Shabbat teaching with Rabbi Adam Kligfeld.
Recently, I was having a conversation with a member of our community who recently entered mourning, became an Avel. And I try to meet with as many members of the community as possible who are entering into a challenging stage. We're talking about this person's grief and memory. And I would say this person is a very active member of the community, not a regular shul goer. Okay. There are a lot of different ways of being involved in community. And at the end of the conversation, I said, I have a suggestion that I want to give to you at the level of prescription. Right? Doctors give prescriptions, and most times patients follow them. Maybe there's such a thing as a spiritual prescription, and maybe sometimes you'll follow them. And I said, I'm not trying to proselytize here and turn a sinner into a saint. I'm thinking about your emotional and spiritual needs. I want to encourage you to hold yourself to a rhythm, to a regimen of coming to shul and saying Kaddish, at least a little more frequently than your shul attendance now. And it does not matter to me if it's 3 times a day, once a week, once a month. Create the regimen and be totally devoted to it. And the reason I want you to do that, aside from the fact that I like seeing you in shul, is because your pathway through mourning will have structure, it'll have coherence, it'll have other people that you would not have been able to anticipate if you do that. It matters. And the response of this person sitting across from me, he took it in and he said, okay. It sounds like a small moment. For me, there was a lot going on. First of all, I don't know that I, as a modern, traditional, progressive, and also, very ensconced in the world of mitzvot rabbi, do that enough. I don't know. How often have I told one of you to go do another mitzvah? Maybe I hold myself back, so I'm not sure. Is that really my role? And I was also thinking, what merit do I have as the rabbi teacher in whatever future Kaddish or prayer is recited by this person? Is it that I've said something to this person and now it's for them to fulfill? Or is there some tether? Is there some connective thread between the person who stimulates another person to do something good and right and holy and the actual act? It started getting me to think about it. By the way, there are streams of Judaism that are really devoted to this way of rabbinic leadership, right? Chabad, about whom many of you know I have many mixed feelings, tremendous admiration for their commitment to God and the Jewish people and their willingness to be out there in the world in places where I don't want to live my life, making sure that there's Jewish life accessible when you get there, admiration. And I have some concerns about their theology and how they don't always play nicely in the sandbox with other Jewish communities. But their ethos is based on the fact that if they can get you to light Shabbat candles, they get credit, cosmic credit, that every future act done by a Jew that was stimulated by the suggestion or the soft coercion by a Chabad Shaliach accrues positively to them. Maybe there's something to that. Maybe there's something to that even in the non-fundamentalist approach to Jewish life. These ideas were swirling my head, and then I came across an interesting commentary on Parshat Pinchas that pushed my thinking further. So I want to share with you these texts, and it's in the category of what's called being a machshir. You see in the Hebrew word machshir there, the root is kaf shin resh. The root means for kosher. Whatever kosher means in the world of kashrut is not really what the word means. Kasher means fit, appropriate. When you go to Israel and you go to the workout room in the hotel, you're going to the cheder kosher. It's not because all the food there has an OU. It's because you're going in there to make yourself fit, okay? So to be a machshir, that's the causative he feel form of the verb, is to make something else fit. And we're going to look at that concept later on, but here is the idea is, what is the role or the significance of the person who makes someone else do the appropriate thing, or encourages them to do the appropriate thing, makes them more fit as a spiritual person. Okay, so we start with, I think, verses 2 and 3 or 3 and 4 of the Parsha. Source number 1, where God says to Moses, say this to Pinchas, Lachain imor, say, Hina nino tainlo et briti shalom. I'm giving Pinchas for his act at the end of last week's Parsha, my covenant of shalom, of peace, or of completion. And then the next verse, V'haita lo ulzaro acharav. Immediately after, what's the connection between his act, this covenant, and what's going to happen in the future? They will be to Zaro, his seed, and to him, acharav, brit kahunat olam. He's getting 2 covenants. The covenant of shalom and the covenant of everlasting priesthood, right? Now, he's from a priestly family, but somehow he's getting an amplification of his priesthood. Tachat, as a result of, tachat means under, but here it means in exchange for, asher kinei lelohav, because he had great zealotry and jealousy in a positive sense for God, v'chaper al bnei Israel, and he wiped the slate clean of the Israelites. So those 2 verses stand on their own, and look at source number 2. This is the Sfat Emet, one of the Rebbes of the Ger Hasidic dynasty, and asks a question which makes an enormous amount of sense if you accept that there's a system in the Torah of reward and punishment, and that it's linear. It makes sense that you get rewarded properly for that which you did, and you get punished properly for that which you did, and there's some relationship there. And he asked the question, first line of source 2, Ma kan hamidah keneged hamidah. In what way was God's promise to Pinchas midah keneged midah, which we would translate as measure for measure? How did the reward fit the action? How does spearing Zimri and therefore ending a licentious plague amongst the Israelites relate to a covenant of priesthood? It seems to be a different category. It seems like, God, you got confused. He did this, but the reward was totally disconnected to it. He has an answer, right? This is a question to which he wants you to think about the question, but he has an answer. Why? Lefi shebe'emet, because after all, in truth, hayu betoch b'nei Yisrael, there was, even amongst the Israelites, even the Israelites who were not taking any steps to stop the terrible things, there was within them shehit bayashu. They were embarrassed by this invasion of bad ethics into their camp. B'maseh Zimri, they were embarrassed by what their fellow Jew Zimri had done by whoring around with a Midianite. V'hitztaru alzeh, and they really were upset. They maybe didn't know what to do with their upset. Sometimes we have a certain righteous rage, but we don't know how to handle it. They had that feeling. And we know that, Kenemar, as it says, Vehema bochim petach ohel moed, because they were weeping at the tent of meeting. Put your finger on that spot in the source for a second, and then turn the page to source 2. Sorry, page 2, source 3. This goes back to the end of Parshat Balak, which is when the whole scene took place. And indeed, the Torah says, in verse 6 of chapter 25, V'hinei ish mi bnei Yisrael, there was a man of the Israelites, he came, vayakrev elachav et ha-Midianit, and he brought a Midianite woman right into the midst of his brothers, le'enei Moshe, brazenly in front of Moses, u'le'enei kol adat bnei Yisrael, and the eyes of all the Israelites, v'hema bochim, they were weeping, petach ohel moed, at the entrance to the tent of meeting. What the Sfat Emet is saying, it's not that Pinchas was the only one amongst the Israelites to know that this was wrong. He just was the only one to do something about it. They knew this was terrible. They knew that something was invading their community that shouldn't have been. They knew it was changing for the worse. They were crying. They were weeping. They felt bad, but they were complacent, and they weren't going to do anything about it. Now go back to the Sfat Emet. end of the second line after the period in the Hebrew. Upinchas, what did Pinchas do? Hotzi machshavatam, he extracted their thoughts, min hakoach, from just the realm of thought, el hapoel, into action. You might say he moved it from potential to kinetic, right? He reified that which they wanted to do but didn't have the ability to do. So his action on some level was on behalf of and represented, according to the Sfat Emet, the actual stirrings of the Israelites. He was the one who did it, but it was for them. And somehow he is the one who kind of gets credit for this act, but he's doing it as a representative of the Israelites who, had they had, I don't know, more chutzpah, more courage, more something, they would have done it too. And now he's going to get to how this is an answer to his question. V'zehi ke'ein avodat kohanim. That's actually what the priestly work was all about. If you think about how the priests operated, what do? They served in the temple. They were not just functionaries. They took the sacrifices that were given to them by the Israelites, and they offered them on the altar, and they said the prayers, and they acted out the spiritual yearnings of the Israelites, the ancient Jews. The ancient Jews didn't offer the sacrifices. The Kohanim did. Back to that source. Kohanim shluchei didan. Kohanim are our emissaries. They do it for us. It's a method of religious life that says, I actually don't have to do it. I have to think that I want to do it, and then someone else is going to do it for me. Anyone ever feel that on a Shabbos morning when you didn't come to shul? Right? That's the system that was in place. Lahotzi avodat halev, to take out the service of the heart, shel b'nei Yisrael, that they're actually holding on to, min hakoach, from just potential, el hapoel, into actual. Ulachein, therefore, midah keneged midah. This is indeed a measure for measure. Magia lo hakuna. That Pinchas gets given the gift of an intense priestly duty for him and his descendants, because what his descendants are going to do, basically doing the religious functions for the Jews, is exactly what he did that day. I feel mixed about this model of spiritual leadership. On the one hand, this is a Hasidic Rebbe praising Pinchas for figuring out that his Hasidim, as it were, I'm mixing metaphors, wanted so badly to do something, but didn't have the vocabulary, didn't have the strength, and he did it for them. Well done. On some level, that actually is how Hasidic society was set up, that you have all these Hasidim, and they funnel their spiritual energy into the Rebbe, and the Rebbe does, and the Rebbe studies, and the Rebbe acts, and they somehow are acting as a result of that, right? Pinchas did what no one else would do, but the community got saved. The Kohanim would offer the sacrifices, and the people, all they had to do was to bring I'm reducing it a bit, all they had to do was to bring an animal, hand it off at the entrance to the temple, and they were done with their activity. They didn't have to open a siddur. They didn't have to put on tefillin, as it were. They didn't actually have to engage in the act of mitzvah. Someone was doing it for them. On the one hand, that ensures, if you believe in the theology undermining this, that the right thing is going to get done because you have a person established, educated, willing to do it. On the other hand, it removes, I think, and it steals from all of you the individual motivation and obligation to be as involved in your spiritual and Jewish life as your rabbi is and as your cantor is. The model indeed shifted. Turn the page. I want to read verse 11, which is a few verses after the one that we read, in order to read another Hasidic commentary, which takes it in a slightly different direction. So, this is source 4. Pinchas ben Elazar, Pinchas the son of Elazar, ben Aaron, so the grandson of Aaron, HaKohen, Heshiv et chamatihi turned back my ire, my anger, me'al b'nei Israel, which had been for the Israelites, bekanoet kinati betucham, an impossible phrase to translate in English. Kuf nun aleph means to be jealous of, to be zealous for, to be overly pious. I gave you Everett Fox's translation on the left side. In his being zealous with my zealous rage in their midst. That's English words, but it's not really an English sentence, right? It's hard to figure out what it means, but somehow Pinchas for funneling his jealousy, zealotry for me, and bringing it out to the people. And therefore, lo chiliti, I did not destroy at Bnei Israel, the Israelites, bikinati, in my own rage. Okay, so the Menachem Mendel of Kotsk, the great Rebbe of the Kotzker Hasidic dynasty, on the phrase bikanoet kinati betucham, that very hard to translate phrase, in Pinchas's being zealous with my zealotry amongst them, what does Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kotsk say? Bikinazo, with this zealotry or jealousy. Again, jealousy in the sense of to be jealous for something is to be totally devoted to it, not envy here. Shekinei Pinchas l'Adonai, that zealotry with which Pinchas was zealous for God, v'haraget Zimri, and killed that Israelite who had brought the Midianite in. He was, and now he's putting quotation marks around the word that was in the verse, betocham. He was among them. He was amidst them. He was a part of them. It looks like he was standing alone, but he wasn't. He shrish betoch b'nei Israel. He shrish is an interesting Hebrew word. It's from the root shoresh. What does shoresh mean? It means root, right? It means to plant within. When you are mashrish, you are planting something that's going to stay, that's going to remain, that's going to grow, that's going to flourish, that's going to become something. He shrish betoch b'nei Israel. He implanted within the Israelites at midat hakina, the very zealotry that he had on his own. The kind of zealotry that would lead to shelo yuchul yisbol ovrei avera, that they would not tolerate sinners and evildoers in their midst again. It's subtly different, the Kotzker Rebbe is saying, from how the Sfat Emet said it. The Sfat Emet said that he knew they already wished to take this action, but they didn't, so he did it for them and everything was kosher. The Kotzker saying, his action planted within them the desire, the recognition to do it in the future. He was an example. He modeled the behavior, not so that it would always be the case that he would be the one to do it and they would be passive, but so that the next time some cancer was invading their society, one of them would step up and take care of it. By the way, for the moment, I'm not dealing with the hard material about whether or not we should be admiring of Pinchas's violence. I'm putting parentheses around that and just extracting from it this idea of a leader doing something on behalf of the followers, or a leader inspiring followers to follow that example in the future. The Kotzker is leaning more in the latter direction. In halacha, in Jewish law, there is a concept called a machshir mitzvah. It's doing the thing that isn't a mitzvah itself, but it makes a mitzvah possible. It's the thing that either completes the object of the mitzvah and allows you to perform that mitzvah, like putting together a lulav. When you are putting together a lulav, you haven't fulfilled a mitzvah. You haven't said a bracha. There's no obligation in the Torah to build the lulav. There's the obligation in the Torah, as understood by the rabbis, to shake the lulav, right? But when you put that lulav together, you are machshir mitzvah. You're making mitzvah possible, right? You're making possible for mitzvah to be fulfilled in the future. Turn the page to this last source. The name of the source at the bottom, page 2. Found this wonderful teacher, Rabbi Michael Avraham. He's a professor of religious studies at Bar Ilan University. He's also got a PhD in theoretical physics, which also tells you something very interesting about him, right? He's like a frum dude. If you look at him online, you'll see he's like, oh, this is a frum guy. Like, this guy spent a lot of time in yeshiva. And he also knows a lot about the world, right? And he's combining his upper-level scientific curiosity with his very, very religious mindset. And he's got a website where he basically is fielding questions from Jews and answering them. and someone asked a question about this topic. What is the relationship between the machshir mitzvah, the act that makes the mitzvah possible, and the mitzvah itself? Is it possible that the former is as significant as the latter? And that if you do the former, and now go back to the way I began this conversation, if you stimulate someone else to do a mitzvah, is that basically on the level of the mitzvah itself? Look at his answer. Top of page 3. She'ila mitzuyanet. Excellent question. Ein mitzvah lasot sukkah. For instance, there's no mitzvah to build a sukkah. The mitzvah is lashevet ba, to dwell in it. When we say the bracha of sukkah, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech al-masher kedishanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu leishev basukkah. There's no livnot sukkah, to build sukkah, to erect a sukkah. The obligation is to sit in it. But you can't sit in it unless it's built, right? So there's no mitzvah to build a sukkah, but rather to dwell in it. Ha'asiyah, the doing of it, the building of it, hirak machshir mitzvah. It's the act that makes the mitzvah possible. Va'adayin yesh dinim ech lasot zot. But there are rules for how to build it. So, he's saying, if there are so many rules for how to build it, but the building of it isn't the mitzvah, maybe the pre-act, the machshir mitzvah, is almost mitzvah-like. Yesh makom lahasik, you could conclude from that, mikan, shahasiyah gam hi mitzvah, that making the thing is the same, is also a mitzvah. V'ulai kol machshir, maybe any time you do an act that makes a mitzvah possible or stimulates someone else to do a mitzvah, hu chelek maha mitzvah atzma, that maybe it's in the same level of holiness. Aval ze lo echrachi. He says, not so fast. When he says lo echrachi, literally means it's not obligatory. You don't have to read it that way, meaning I'm not sure. He's not rejecting it, I'm not sure. It's a subtle category. Shekayin yitachen. It could be. Shahatorah rak omeret. The Torah simply says, Ketzad tzarich lehasod hachefetz. How do you have to make the object? Shemishamesh lemitzvah, which serves the purpose of a mitzvah. Aval ein ba'asiyah shum mitzvah. But it's still the case that making the thing is not a mitzvah itself. Hatana she'im hachefetz lo nasekach. The argument is that it's true that if the object wasn't made that way, properly, therefore, shetikayem et hamitzvah, when you perform the mitzvah, lo kiyamtata, you didn't really observe it, bechefetz hanachon, in the right way, because it was not a sukkah. We believe that. If you enter into a building with the intent to fulfill the mitzvah of being leishev basukah, and it wasn't built according to the halachic specifications, even though when building it no one was performing any mitzvah, according to Jewish law, you have not fulfilled the mitzvah sukkah. The sukkah has to be proper for it to be sukkah. If you take 4 other species together and shake it out of gratitude to God in the fall and say, I've performed the mitzvah of ulakachtem lachem, the mitzvah from the Torah that says you should take these species, you have shown that you're interested in religious life, but you haven't performed the mitzvah of lulav. So the argument is that, yes, there's significance to making the item proper, because if you don't, then there's no mitzvah possible, but it's different than actually doing the mitzvah. Kach lamashal ro'im bedin lishma. This is similar to a category, something called lishma, for its own sake. There are several places in religious life where preparation has to be done, and when the person is doing the preparation, they have to say something that says that they're doing it with the right intention. A sofer. No matter how skilled you are writing a Torah scroll, if you know all the rules, you can't just sit down and start writing Breshit Bara. You have to make a declaration that you're doing this with the intent to create a kosher Torah. And if you don't, no matter how glistening and perfect the Torah scroll is when you're done, it is not a kosher Torah according to Jewish law. And if you read from it with the intent of fulfilling the mitzvah of reading Torah, you haven't done anything. That's the category Lishma. I give you some other examples. There's third to the last line in Hebrew. Shenasov al hachanat chafatzim lamitzvah. This is revolving around preparing objects for mitzvah. V'lo al peulat hamitzvah, mitzvah, atzma. But not in actually doing the action. Benigud lekavanah. This is slightly different than the notion of kavanah, intent. Shehu ba'asiyat ha-mitzvah atzma. That's the intent you have, like, I have to have intent when I say the Shema to declare that God is one. And if I say the words and I have had no intent in my prayers, the prayers have no efficacy. That's when doing the mitzvah. Lishma is leading up to it. He gives some examples. Afiyat matzah lishma. You can't just cook ground grain and water before 18 minutes have passed into a square with holes and have it be matzah unless you have said that you're doing it lishma, in the name of making matzah. Tzitzit lishma. If you are a weaver weaving wool and you create these fringes and they look perfect and they're the right number and they're made from the right ingredients, unless in the course of the action you said you're doing it lishma for the sake of making tzitzit, whatever object you end up with at the end, it's not a kosher tzitzit. Sukkah lishma, right? You are supposed to, when you are building your sukkah, make it clear that you're building it for this purpose. It's not just by coincidence that in October you're building a hut with at least 2.5 walls and schach. You're building it for the sake of mitzvah. V'chadoma. And others like it. Kol elu einam mitzvot. Those acts are not mitzvot. It is not a mitzvah to weave tzitzit. It's not a mitzvah to bake matzah. It's not a mitzvah to build a sukkah. They are not mitzvot. Va'adayin yesh klalim, but there are rules. Hilchatiim, halachic rules. Ketzad latzot otam. How to do them. What do I take from this material other than, besides an interesting dive into how certain objects are made for mitzvah purposes? I hope it's clear from the way I and my beloved colleagues at Temple Beth do our work, is that we don't believe that the Pinchas model that was valorized by the Sfat Emet, but that the Kohen model is the right model for this religious era and this religious community. I don't live my Jewish life so that you don't have to. I don't put on tefillin in the morning to spare you. And your march towards a meaningful religious life, it might accrue on my ledger on some level in the world to come that I got that many more people to come to Minyan. But ultimately, that is between you and the Holy One and not between me and the Holy One. And as a rabbi in the 21st century who recognizes that our community is wonderfully diverse and wonderfully at different places on the spectrum of how they map out their mitzvah life, I want you to know explicitly, I'm going to move from the implicit to the explicit, that it is the case that part of my work, part of my raison d'etre, part of the reason why I breathe air every day is to live long enough to have as sufficient interactions with as many of you as possible, such that your, hopefully, deep, innate interest in connecting with the transcendent and connecting with the divine and living a life of mitzvot will flourish in your life, in your world. It's part of why I do what I do. And going back to the person who I spoke about at the beginning of this conversation, I do hope for that person's emotional, spiritual, and psychological well-being that they come to Minyan a little more, that they say Kaddish a little more often, that their grief for their parent is concretized in our rituals. And I don't need any sign from Hashem to say that my religious life is richer as a result. The satisfaction I will get is seeing that person's religious life become more meaningful to that person. It's not always clear what's happening in the mind of a rabbi or a cantor, religious leader, and sometimes I think it's worthwhile to actually say it out in those words. I welcome and we welcome everyone into this community, no matter how many mitzvot they did or did not perform last week. I hope that is clear. This is a completely non-judgmental religious community, even though we have standards inside our building. but I want you to aspire, and I want you to reach, and I want you to do more, not for my benefit, but for yours.
You've been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast website or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information on Temple Beth Am, Los Angeles, please visit www.tbala.org.